Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code has sparked both interest and skepticism concerning historical reliability of the canonical gospel accounts. While this webinar series is not the place for a prolonged discussion of the Da Vinci Code's many problems, which several excellent books have already done, it is worthwhile for us to briefly consider some of its pitfalls here for integrity of the risen Christ is at stake. First, there is no real evidence the Gospel of Mary was written by Mary Magdalene. Most scholars now believe her name was attached to the book by 2nd century individuals attempting to add credibility to the text. The scholarly consensus is the Gospel of Mary was written between 150 to 200 AD, long past the period when it could be considered historically reliable. Also, the concept Jesus was married to and had children with Mary Magdalene is supported by neither the Gospel of Mary nor any other Gnostic writing. It would not matter even if such claims were actually made within these documents, for they were all created too far after Jesus or Mary's life to have any serious historical credibility. Further, there is no evidence whatsoever Constantine gathered and burned what he considered to be all the non-canonical gospel documents in the 4th century, nor that the early church suppressed certain gospels to consolidate their power. Such declarations are purely fiction. Additionally, we know the reality of Jesus' divine claims was a 1st century historical fact and not a later legend created at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Beyond the obvious references to Jesus' deity in the Bible, early Christians such as Ignatius, writing in 107 AD, declared Jesus was and is God incarnate, God himself appearing in the form of man. He was only one of many early Christians convinced Christ was God. Also, there is no evidence for the idea Christianity was a copycat creation of pagan mystery religions such as Mithraism. This theory has been thoroughly debunked by critical scholars. Further, the Bible is not a product of mere men, for the specifically fulfilled prophecy within it is unexplainable without the existence of a divine author. Additionally, the Da Vinci Code does nothing to disprove the well-established fact the Gospels were early written and historically reliable documents. 1st century eyewitness apostles certainly were in a much better position to know the actual state of affairs than a modern person like Brown or even a 15th century individual like Leonardo da Vinci, whose controversial painting, The Last Supper, portrays several known inaccuracies concerning 1st century customs. The Da Vinci Code also has no adequate explanation for the empty tomb, which historical documentation demonstrates was omitted by even the spiritual opponents of Christ. Likewise, the Da Vinci Code has no adequate explanation for the historically verifiable transformation and voluntary martyrdom of the apostles, strong skeptics like Peter, Thomas, James, Judah, and Paul, or countless 1st century Jews. These people surely would not have willingly died for Christ unless they knew he was still alive. Some have declared there would exist many more accounts of Jesus' miraculous life, death, burial, and especially his resurrection if it really happened. These theorists believe the lack of references mean the resurrection was not really dramatic and likely never occurred. However, few records of any type remain from the ancient world, so we have a relatively small pool of accounts to draw from to begin with. We know, based upon references in later works, that many of the writings which were once in existence have now been lost. For example, the texts of Thales, Asclepius, of Mendes, and the 144 books of Nicholas of Damascus are completely gone, while most of Livy's, Papias's, Quadratus, Hegesippus, and half of Tacitus' works have been eliminated. Also, writing was also an arduous task during the 1st century AD, since there were no computers, publishers, or distributors to quickly produce and disseminate a text to large audiences worldwide. Rather, all copies had to be handwritten, and most were delivered by foot. The situation probably discouraged many potential authors from attempting to write, unless they were highly motivated to do so. It is important to note that Jewish religious leaders were highly motivated to dismiss the gospel news and have the financial means to publish their observations. This is why it is so incredible we possess not even one report from them which denies the sinless, prophetic, miraculous, and physically risen nature of Christ within the still existing ancient testimony of the Talmud or other Jewish writings such as those from Josephus. Further, Jesus came from a humble carpenter's home in the lowly regarded town of Nazareth, and his 3.5-year ministry was confined to a fairly small geographical area within the first century world. Since his gospel, by design, was not spread far and wide until after the apostles began preaching in earnest, it is not surprising he failed to receive more written, non-biblical news coverage. Despite these conditions, the information we have concerning Christ, even outside of the New Testament, is still very impressive. For example, while we have only 5 sources for Julius Caesar, one of Rome's most famous and influential emperors, and a mere 10 sources for Tiberius Caesar, the Roman emperor reigning during Jesus' earthly lifetime, at least 42 authors, including 33 non-biblical and non-Christian writers, mention Jesus within 150 years after his resurrection. So one must conclude, based upon this textual historical evidence, that Jesus' influence upon his society was more memorable than 2 of the most prominent Roman emperors. We really do have a tremendous amount of historical documentation for Christ.